Under the burning sun of the African savanna, where the horizon stretched wide and shimmered in the heat, a restless wind swept across the golden plains, stirring up the dust and carrying with it the distant cries of animals that lived and died according to the eternal rhythm of survival. There came a moment unlike any the land had seen before, for deep in the heart of this wilderness, a lion lay struggling, not with the rivalries of his own kind but with the relentless snapping jaws of a pack of jackals who had sensed weakness and gathered with their shrill laughter, surrounding him in a tightening circle, their bodies lean, their eyes hungry, and their teeth flashing like white knives in the fierce sunlight. The lion, a male with a mane dark as smoke and heavy with dust, stood his ground though his flanks bore the marks of a recent wound, perhaps from a territorial fight with another lion, or perhaps from the horn of a buffalo in some earlier clash, but now his strength was faltering, his breath came in ragged growls, and as the jackals darted in and out, biting at his legs and tail, the mighty king of beasts seemed for the first time to know the taste of desperation. Yet the story did not end in his fall, for from the far edge of the plain came a deep rumble, a sound that rolled across the grass like thunder carried on 4 legs, and into the circle strode a buffalo, massive and fearless, his curved horns gleaming like crescent moons, his bulk casting a shadow that dwarfed the snarling jackals, his eyes dark with fury at the injustice unfolding before him, and without hesitation he charged, the earth trembling beneath his hooves, dust exploding in plumes as he plowed forward, scattering the jackals with a violence they had not anticipated, for while they were cunning scavengers, they were no match for 2,000 pounds of living muscle and rage, and the lion, staggering, lifted his head in astonishment as the buffalo barreled into his attackers, tossing one jackal high into the air with a flick of his horn, driving others away with the sheer force of his presence, his breath steaming in the hot air, his bellows echoing like war drums across the plain. And as the jackals scrambled, yelping, the lion collapsed onto his side, panting, his body trembling, but safe, protected by the very creature he had once eyed as prey. The buffalo then circled him, stamping the ground, glaring at the retreating scavengers, and only when the threat had vanished into the tall grass did he slow, turning his massive head toward the lion, who blinked up at him with eyes both proud and humbled, for never had the king of beasts been defended by another, let alone by one who had every reason to despise him. Yet the buffalo stood firm, as though acknowledging some greater law of survival, some bond beyond predator and prey. And then, as the sun began to sink lower, painting the savanna with strokes of red and gold, the lion gathered enough strength to rise, wincing, his legs unsteady, and he gave a low rumble, not of threat but of respect, a sound meant not for an enemy but for an ally, and the buffalo snorted in return, the 2 giants of the land regarding each other in the waning light, until finally the lion limped away into the brush, leaving behind pawprints smeared with blood, while the buffalo remained to guard the place where the battle had been fought, his silhouette carved in fire against the horizon. And so the tale of their strange meeting spread on the winds, whispered among the herds and echoed in the cries of the hyenas that night, for all creatures knew something extraordinary had passed between lion and buffalo. And it was not the end, for the jackals, shamed and enraged by their defeat, began to scheme, vowing to return in greater numbers, while the lion, though proud, carried the memory of his rescue in his heart, a debt that weighed upon him, so that when the cycle of violence returned, when the jackals came again with their snapping teeth and shrill cries, he did not call upon his pride to defend him, but stood alone, knowing in some primal way that the buffalo would return, that the bond forged in blood and dust had not been broken. And though the night grew darker and the jackals grew bolder, the lion's eyes glowed with defiance and a strange faith, for somewhere beyond the ridge, the thunder of hooves was already rising once more. Beneath the vast African night sky, painted deep indigo and spattered with 1,000 sharp stars, the savanna breathed in silence save for the restless stir of insects and the occasional distant cry of a hyena. And yet within that silence a tension grew, invisible but heavy, for the jackals had not forgotten. Their pride had been torn to shreds the night the buffalo came to scatter them like frightened birds, and they licked their wounds in secret places, gnashing their teeth against their shame, gathering in greater numbers, whispering their intentions beneath the pale wash of moonlight, their eyes glowing green with hatred and hunger, their bodies restless with vengeance, until finally their leader, a gaunt shadow with a scar across his muzzle, rose and hissed a call that sent the pack flowing like liquid shadow across the plains. dozens upon dozens moving as one, tails low, ears pricked, their laughter not joyous but sharp, shrill, promising violence, and their destination was already chosen, for they knew the lion was alone. The once mighty king who had roared his dominion across the grasslands now lay wounded, his mane tangled, his flank scarred, his body thinned by hunger, yet his pride had kept him from summoning his pride, as though some part of him resisted the weakness of asking for help, perhaps because he remembered the buffalo, the massive savior who had come like thunder to scatter the jackals before, and perhaps because deep in the lion's ancient heart there had taken root a strange new faith that this battle, too, would call forth that same unlikely ally, though reason told him such miracles did not repeat themselves, but still, he waited in silence, golden eyes catching the light of the stars as he lay stretched beneath the skeletal branches of a thorn tree by a dried riverbed, his ears twitching at every rustle, his tail flicking as if beating against his own impatience, until at last he heard them, the padding of many paws through the dust, the shrill yips and snickers as the jackals closed in, forming their circle once more, wider this time, hungrier, bolder, and the lion rose, slow and deliberate, his mane rising like smoke around his scarred face, his growl low and rumbling, a sound that made the nearest jackals flinch though they pressed forward still, and for a long moment predator and scavenger measured each other in the moonlight, a ring of teeth and shadows tightening around the golden heart that refused to fall, the lion shifting his weight to keep them all in sight, his muscles tense though exhaustion dragged at them, his breath a hiss between his teeth, until the first jackal darted in and snapped at his hind leg, retreating before the claws could strike, then another at his flank, another at his shoulder, testing, probing, and the lion roared, his voice rolling across the plain like a storm breaking, scattering birds from the thorn trees. Yet the jackals came again, emboldened by their numbers, weaving in and out, their laughter sharp, their eyes blazing, and the lion struck back, claws slashing, teeth snapping, his body a blur of fury, but the circle held, pressing tighter, pressing harder, and for a moment it seemed the king would fall beneath the tide of hunger and hate, until from beyond the ridges came again that impossible sound, the deep thunder that belonged not to sky but to earth, the drumbeat of hooves pounding against dry ground, closer, louder, swelling until the very air trembled with it. And then the buffalo came, massive, terrible, unstoppable, his breath streaming in great clouds beneath the moon, his horns glinting like silver scythes, and with a bellow that shook the marrow of bone, he charged into the circle, scattering jackals like leaves before a hurricane, his hooves smashing the earth, his horns flashing, his body carrying the weight of mountains, and the jackals shrieked in terror as he plowed through them, tossing one high into the night, trampling another beneath his hooves, his fury endless, and the lion, astonished yet not surprised, surged forward too, his roar joining the buffalo's bellow in a symphony of rage, his claws tearing into the scavengers who dared to dart close, and suddenly the night was alive with chaos, jackals yelping, dust rising in choking clouds, the ground trembling beneath the storm of horn and claw, and together, predator and prey turned warriors. The lion and the buffalo fought side by side, not as enemies but as brothers, their movements strange yet harmonious, the lion leaping upon those who slipped past the buffalo's charge, the buffalo lowering his massive head to gore those who lunged for the lion's haunches, the air thick with the stench of blood and sweat, the cries of the jackals unraveling into panic as their numbers broke, their courage fleeing, until finally, as dawn's first pale fingers reached across the horizon, the pack dissolved, streaming away into the tall grass, tails between their legs, their cries dwindling into silence, and then there was only the sound of heavy breathing, of hooves shifting in the dust, of a low rumble in the lion's throat that was not a growl but something softer, a sound almost like gratitude, and the buffalo, great chest heaving, stood over him, his eyes dark, his body streaked with dust and blood but unbowed, and the two regarded each other as the sun rose, painting their silhouettes in gold and fire, and in that moment the savannah bore witness to something it had never seen, something it would never forget, for in a land ruled by hunger and fear, by predator and prey, there had been born an alliance forged not by need alone but by something greater, something that echoed beyond instinct, and though neither creature could name it, the truth was clear in the silence between them, a silence heavy with respect, with promise, with the beginning of legend. And yet this was only the second chapter of their story, for the jackals, though beaten, were not gone, their hatred burned hotter than ever, their shame curdling into rage, and in hidden corners of the wilderness they gathered again, whispering of revenge, plotting with sharper hunger, and the lion, though grateful, knew this truth as well, for his wound still bled, his body still trembled, and yet within his heart was no despair, only the knowledge that when the storm returned, he would not face it alone, for somewhere on the wind there would come again the thunder of hooves, and together, lion and buffalo would meet whatever darkness dared to rise against them. The night deepened over the plains, stretching a canvas of darkness lit only by scattered stars and a pale crescent moon, and the buffalo stood firm at the edge of the open road, the weight of everything he had endured pressing into his heavy shoulders, yet his resolve holding stronger than ever, for around him the whispers of the land carried stories of survival, sacrifice, and bonds that transcended the wild instincts of predator and prey, and though he bore scars both visible and hidden, he carried them as symbols of his journey, of the countless trials he had faced not as a creature of brute force alone but as a living testament to courage and compassion, and as the night wind curled through the tall grass, carrying the faint scent of dust, earth, and distant water, he began to walk, his massive frame moving with a rhythm that echoed the heartbeat of the land itself, steady and purposeful, a reminder that no matter how many storms tore across the savanna or how many hunters prowled under the cover of night, he remained, unbroken, unwilling to surrender to despair, because within him lay a fire that could not be extinguished. His hooves pressed into the soft earth, leaving imprints that seemed to glow under the moonlight, as though the land itself recognized him, honored his passage, and the silence around him was not empty but alive, filled with the rustle of unseen animals moving in the brush, the quiet chirping of insects that seemed to keep time with his steps, and the occasional howl of a predator calling into the night, reminding him of the eternal cycle of survival that bound them all together, and still he walked, his eyes forward, his senses sharp, for though he had chosen compassion time and again, though he had placed himself in danger to protect the small, the weak, and the vulnerable, he knew the world did not always repay such acts, and danger lingered in every shadow. Yet he did not falter, for within his mind lingered the memory of the small kitten, frail yet unafraid, lying on the road as though testing the patience of fate itself, and he remembered the way its tiny body had curled into the dirt, fragile and helpless, the way he had lowered his massive head to nudge it gently, inhaling the faint scent of fur and fear, and how that single moment had shifted something inside him, reminding him that even the strongest had a duty to protect those who could not defend themselves, that his strength meant nothing if not used to shield life instead of destroy it. That memory burned bright now as he crossed into new lands, passing beyond the familiar watering holes and grazing grounds of his herd, moving into stretches of wilderness that few dared tread, where rivers cut deep scars into the earth and thorny bushes tangled together like nets meant to trap the unwary, and still he pressed forward, guided not by instinct alone but by a deeper purpose, a calling that told him his journey was not yet over, that the bond between beast and small creature, between protector and the protected, demanded more of him than simple survival. As dawn began to creep across the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of gold and crimson, the buffalo came upon a clearing where the ground bore signs of struggle, tufts of fur, broken branches, tracks pressed deep into the dirt as though something had been chased, cornered, and dragged away, and he lowered his head, sniffing at the traces, recognizing the scent of lions, sharp and musky, mixed with the faint lingering presence of fear, and he felt his muscles tense, his breath huff through his nostrils in heavy bursts, for he knew what this meant. Somewhere near, another life hung in the balance, another fragile creature perhaps caught in the jaws of predators, another chance for him to stand between destruction and survival. He followed the trail, his massive body weaving through the brush with surprising silence, his ears flicking to catch every sound, and soon he reached the edge of a shallow ravine where the faint cry of something small and desperate echoed against the stone walls, and his eyes narrowed, catching sight of a young antelope calf trapped against the rocks, trembling as a trio of lions stalked closer, their golden coats blending almost seamlessly with the morning light, their movements slow and predatory, confident in their hunt, yet as the buffalo stepped forward, the ground trembling beneath his hooves, the lions froze, their eyes turning toward him with a mix of annoyance and caution, for they knew him, knew his size, his power, and the scars that told the story of battles fought before. The buffalo snorted, lowering his horns, his stance wide, daring them to take another step, and for a tense moment the air crackled with the promise of violence, predator and defender locked in a standoff that echoed the eternal struggle between hunger and protection. But the lions, reading the fire in his eyes, reading the steadiness of his resolve, began to back away, their tails lashing in frustration as they slinked back into the grass, their hunt abandoned. The calf trembled, unable to move, and the buffalo approached slowly, gently, lowering his head once more as he had with the kitten, nudging the small creature to its feet, encouraging it until it stumbled up the ravine and darted into the safety of the brush, leaving him once again alone in the clearing, alone but not empty, for each act of compassion filled him with a strength far greater than any battle could, a strength that came not from muscle or horn but from the unyielding choice to protect instead of destroy. He lingered there, the silence of the savannah returning around him, and as the day stretched on, he continued his journey, moving through landscapes that grew harsher, drier, where the sun baked the earth into cracked patterns and water grew scarce, yet he endured, driven by something larger than his own survival, by the invisible thread that seemed to pull him forward, a thread woven from all the lives he had touched, from the kitten to the calf to countless others who had crossed his path, each one leaving behind a mark on his soul. The nights grew colder, the stars sharper, and still he pressed on, sometimes finding himself pursued by shadows of hunters, their scent thick with smoke and steel, their eyes greedy and cruel, and when he heard the distant crack of rifles, he would vanish into the night, his steps sure, his body blending with the land, for he had learned not only to fight but to outwit, to survive not through brute defiance alone but through wisdom carved by years of hardship, and though he often found himself alone, the memory of the small ones he had saved kept loneliness from consuming him, for he knew that somewhere, because of his choices, life continued, fragile hearts beat, and the cycle endured. He became more than a buffalo, more than prey or survivor, he became a legend whispered by the winds, a guardian whose presence could not be denied, whose path through the savannah left echoes that others followed, and though he could not speak words, his actions told the story, a story of loyalty, courage, sacrifice, and above all, compassion, the one force strong enough to defy the endless hunger of the wild. And so he moved forward, into lands unknown, beneath skies that stretched wider than eternity, carrying with him not only the weight of his own survival but the hopes of all he had protected, knowing that as long as he drew breath, the savannah would have a guardian, silent yet steadfast, a shadow of strength against the darkness, and though his journey was far from over. The buffalo stood at the edge of the plain as if the entire horizon depended on his presence, his massive frame dark against the fading glow of twilight, his breath rolling in thick clouds that vanished into the cooling air, and though the land seemed quiet with the grasses bending under the soft rhythm of the evening breeze there was a restless stirring inside him, a pull between the memory of all that had already been endured and the knowledge that what lay ahead would demand even greater strength, for the trials that had once seemed insurmountable now felt like only preludes to something deeper, something that asked not just for the force of muscle but for the endurance of spirit, and in that stillness he recalled the countless moments where his hooves had beaten against earth and stone, where predators had circled with hunger in their eyes, where storms had descended with blinding rain and shattering winds, where humans had appeared at the edges of his world with fire, noise, and weapons, yet through each of these moments the buffalo had carried forward, sometimes wounded, sometimes limping, but never yielding entirely, never breaking the thread that tied him to the great cycle of the plains, and now as the shadows stretched long and the stars began to emerge he felt that same thread tugging at him, urging him to move forward even when his body longed for rest, even when his legs ached with the weight of his years, because the call was not simply for survival anymore, it was for meaning, for something beyond the ordinary struggle of life and death that defined the animals around him, for he had been shaped by the trials in ways even he did not fully comprehend, carrying within him not just the strength to endure but the strange ability to feel the weight of others, their fear, their hope, their pain. And perhaps it was this that made him linger when the calf had been lost and needed protection, when the lion had been ensnared and cried for release. When the small creatures that had no chance against the endless dangers of the wild had somehow survived because he had placed himself in harm's way, and now the land seemed to whisper that another moment of decision approached, larger than any he had known before, a moment that would define not just his path but the very balance of the herds, of the predators, of the humans who encroached ever closer with roads, fences, and machines that cut through the wilderness, for his journey had become more than his own survival. It had become a story that rippled through every life that touched the plain, a story of resistance, of compassion, of endurance, and though he could not know it, the humans too had begun to speak of him in hushed tones, stories passing through villages of a lone buffalo that defied death, that stood between life and ruin again and again, and some feared him while others revered him as if he were not merely an animal but a guardian spirit in flesh. And as the night deepened, he began to move once more, slow at first, his hooves pressing into the cool soil, then steady with the rhythm that had carried him across countless miles, each step drawing him toward the unknown yet guided by the same instinct that had carried his kind for generations, until he came upon the river, wide and glistening with the reflection of stars, its surface broken only by the ripples of fish and the distant movement of crocodiles who watched with ancient patience. And here the buffalo paused, for crossing meant danger, yet not crossing meant delay, and behind him he sensed the faint rustle of movement, perhaps predators, perhaps men, and so he stepped into the water, the current pressing against his legs, rising higher with every stride, his body straining to keep balance, but still he pressed forward, his horns cutting through the mist that clung above the surface, until the far bank loomed before him, and with one last surge he emerged, dripping, exhausted, but alive. And in that moment he raised his head and bellowed, a sound that rolled across the plain like thunder, not of fear, not of warning, but of defiance, of presence, as if declaring to all who listened that he remained, that he would continue, and that the struggle of life upon this earth was not yet finished. And so through the night he traveled, guided by starlight, by the scent of grass, by the unyielding beat of his heart, until dawn rose again and revealed a land both familiar and strange, scarred by fire in places, blossoming with new shoots in others, and everywhere the signs of change, for nothing remained untouched by time. And yet in the center of this shifting world the buffalo endured, each trial behind him only sharpening his resolve for what lay ahead, for he knew deep within that the greatest test still awaited, hidden beyond the horizon, waiting for the day when his strength, his courage, and his compassion would be called upon in ways that even he could not yet imagine. And so the story of the buffalo pressed forward with him, unbroken, unstoppable, carrying within it the essence of survival and the echo of something far greater, something eternal, that whispered to the land, to the animals, to the people, that so long as he stood, the spirit of the wild itself could not be extinguished. The buffalo rose again in the pale light of dawn, its massive body aching from the long trek through the wilderness, but its spirit unbroken, carrying the invisible scars of battles fought, storms endured, and bonds formed with the land itself, for the plains had become more than just a home. It was a mirror of the buffalo's own endurance, vast, scarred, beautiful, and relentless. And as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the horizon, the buffalo's dark hide glistened with dew, making it seem as though the earth itself had placed its blessing upon the creature, urging it forward on a path no other beast could truly understand. For this buffalo's journey was not simply survival but something deeper, something written into the marrow of its bones and the rhythm of its hooves striking the ground, a call older than memory itself. As the buffalo moved along a riverbank, the water whispering with secrets of distant mountains and unseen valleys, the land around it began to change, with tall reeds bending in the wind and birds swooping low, their wings catching golden light before darting away into the wilderness. And though the buffalo felt the weight of loneliness in its broad chest, it also sensed that every creature around it acknowledged its passage, as if the wilderness itself paused to recognize the endurance of one who had walked through both fire and storm without faltering. Soon the buffalo came across a place where the river curved into a quiet lagoon, and here the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and the soft buzzing of insects rising in the morning warmth. And though danger always lurked in these wild places, the buffalo sensed a fragile peace, a rare moment when the world seemed to hold its breath, and lowering its head, it drank deeply, the cool water sliding over its tongue, filling its veins with strength anew. Yet even in that peace, echoes of struggle stirred within its mind, the memory of lions' roars, the flash of hyenas' teeth, the sting of dust storms, the loneliness of nights under stars too numerous to count, all of them threads woven into the fabric of its existence. And as the buffalo lifted its head once more, droplets falling from its muzzle, it felt that these memories were not burdens but signs of its survival, Proof that it had walked paths many would not dare and endured storms that would have crushed others, and so, with the sun climbing higher, the buffalo turned away from the lagoon and pressed onward, guided by instinct and something greater than instinct, a pull as if the horizon itself was calling. The day grew hot, the grasses brittle beneath its heavy hooves, cicadas screaming in the stillness, and though hunger gnawed at its belly and thirst returned faster than it could drink, the buffalo did not stop, for movement itself was survival, and survival was purpose, and in its heart, though it could not speak, it carried a message: endurance is meaning, and meaning is endurance, the two forever bound in the rhythm of its beating heart. The terrain grew rougher, with rocky ridges breaking the monotony of grassland, and the buffalo's hide was scratched by thorn bushes, its legs carrying bruises and small cuts, but these wounds meant little to a creature forged by trial, for the buffalo did not dwell on pain, it simply continued, each step both a struggle and a triumph, and as it crested a ridge, the world spread out before it in a panorama of endless earth and sky, a canvas painted with resilience, and though it was only one creature upon it, the buffalo felt immense, as if its life alone carried the weight of all those who had walked before it, a living echo of generations that had faced the same hardships, endured the same dangers, and walked the same sun-scorched paths. Night fell once more, stars pricking the black sky, and the buffalo stood still, its breath clouding in the cooling air, listening to the distant sounds of predators stirring, the faint howl of something unseen, the rustle of life hidden in the tall grasses, yet it did not tremble, for it had stood against worse and still remained, and so it lowered its body onto the earth, resting but never surrendering, sleeping but always alert, the wilderness its companion and its judge. Days blurred into nights and nights into days, each blending seamlessly as the buffalo's journey unfolded like an endless song, yet through fatigue, through hunger, through the aching loneliness of one who moves alone, the buffalo carried within it a quiet strength that grew with every step, and though the world around it shifted constantly, one truth remained: the buffalo would not yield, not to the claws of lions, not to the hunger in its belly, not to the weariness in its limbs, not to the silence of solitude, for it was not simply a beast surviving but a spirit moving, a force of nature that even time itself seemed to respect. Storms came again, great black clouds swallowing the horizon, thunder cracking like ancient drums, rain lashing against its hide until rivers formed in the earth beneath its hooves, but still the buffalo walked, its massive head lowered against the wind, every step forward a declaration that it would not bow, and when the storm finally broke and the land lay cleansed, the buffalo emerged from the sheets of rain stronger, its dark hide shining as if polished by the sky itself. Weeks turned into months, and still the buffalo roamed, across valleys and ridges, through burned lands where wildfires had stripped the earth bare, across fertile meadows bursting with new life, through forests where shadows wrapped around its body, and though the miles behind it stretched endlessly, the buffalo did not look back, for it knew instinctively that the journey was not about what was left behind but about the constant forward motion, the living of each moment with the strength to continue. At times, other creatures crossed its path, a herd of zebras galloping in the distance, antelopes pausing to stare before bounding away, even once a pack of wild dogs trailing in the shadows, but none stayed long, and none could truly join in the path the buffalo walked, for this path belonged only to it, carved by hooves that would not stop, written in dust that rose with each step, a story told not in words but in survival. And as the seasons shifted, as grasses grew and withered, as rains came and dried, the buffalo pressed onward, an unyielding figure moving across the vast, merciless, and beautiful face of the earth, carrying within it the simple but profound truth that to endure is to live, and to live is to endure, and in the endless journey of this buffalo, the wilderness itself found its reflection. The buffalo stood silently in the golden morning light, its massive frame still scarred from the battles it had endured yet carried with the dignity of a creature that knew the meaning of survival, and as the days had stretched into weeks and the weeks into months the vast plain had begun to change around it, rains carving small rivulets through the dust, grass pushing up in patches where before there had been only cracked earth, and the buffalo sensed in the shifting winds that a new trial awaited, one that would not be of predators but of the land itself, because the herd it had once known was scattered, some gone, some lost, and some perhaps still wandering miles away in search of water, yet here it stood bound not by chance but by the will to protect the fragile lives that still clung to it, for the kitten, now grown into a lean young cat, remained close to its hooves, never straying far, its eyes reflecting both wildness and devotion, and in the distance the humans who had once merely watched were now building, their figures moving with purpose as wooden posts rose from the ground marking fences that cut across the once free territory, and the buffalo knew instinctively that the freedom of roaming that had defined its existence was being slowly hemmed in, each post a quiet threat, each hammer strike a warning, yet it did not move away. It lingered because within its heart was etched the memory of that moment when it had chosen to save rather than destroy, when it had bent its horned head to lift a helpless creature instead of leaving it behind, and this bond, improbable as it was, had altered its path, kept it here even when instinct would have carried it to other horizons, and so day by day it wandered the edges of the human settlement, its dark eyes following them with both suspicion and understanding, until one morning it felt the tremor of the earth beneath its hooves, not the gentle shift of rain-soaked soil but the deep rumble of something unnatural, and lifting its head it saw machines, monstrous creatures of metal and fire, rolling toward the land, tearing through brush and grass, spewing smoke that stung its nostrils, and the humans cheered beside them as if this invasion of sound and destruction was a triumph rather than a wound upon the earth, and the buffalo stamped its hoof, the kitten arched its back, and together they faced the rising storm of change, for soon the machines would reach the watering hole, the last refuge of countless animals, and the buffalo felt in its bones that it could not allow that sanctuary to vanish without resistance, so it walked, slowly at first then with growing determination, its bulk casting a long shadow that even the machines seemed to hesitate before, and the humans stopped their noise, their hammers silenced, their voices hushed as they turned to watch this solitary titan move into their midst, and some pointed, some shouted, but none dared approach, for though they had weapons and fire, the sight of such raw strength, such undeniable will, froze them, and in that silence the buffalo reached the first of the wooden posts, pressed its forehead against it, and with a single surge of muscle and fury snapped it from the earth, splinters flying, the fence collapsing like brittle bone, and it turned to the next, and the next, until the humans realized that their barriers meant nothing against a creature that carried the weight of the land itself in its stride, and when the machines moved forward the buffalo lowered its horns and let out a bellow that rolled across the plain like thunder, shaking the air, startling birds into flight, and the machines halted, their engines coughing, their drivers unsure, and in that hesitation the buffalo charged, not to kill, not to destroy, but to stand, its horns clashing against steel, sparks flying, and the machine reeled back, wheels digging into the dirt as the men inside cried out, and again the buffalo struck. Relentless, until the machine retreated, leaving scars upon its own armor, and though others roared to life the buffalo remained unshaken, circling the watering hole, its body a living wall, its eyes ablaze with defiance, and the kitten leapt onto a nearby rock, hissing, its small voice joining the symphony of resistance, and the humans, bewildered, divided among themselves, argued whether to press forward or pull back, some whispering that this was no ordinary animal, that it carried the spirit of something older, something the machines could not break, while others shouted that progress demanded sacrifice, that the land must bend, but even as they argued the sky grew heavy with clouds, thick and dark, and the first drops of rain fell, soaking the earth, and the buffalo lifted its head to the storm, welcoming it, for it knew that nature itself was its ally, and soon the ground beneath the machines turned to mud, wheels sinking, engines sputtering, and the humans cursed, their triumph dissolving, and in that chaos the buffalo stood tall, unyielding, a reminder that the earth itself had chosen guardians not of iron but of flesh and spirit, and when the storm broke fully, lightning tearing the heavens, the buffalo's silhouette was illuminated against the flashing sky, horns glistening, body trembling yet unbroken, and the humans fled, dragging their machines, leaving behind shattered fences and trampled posts, and when the plain quieted once more the buffalo turned to the kitten, nuzzled it gently with its massive head, and together they walked back toward the heart of the land, the watering hole rippling with new rain, and though the scars remained both on its body and upon the earth the buffalo understood that the fight was not over, that as long as humans hungered for more there would be battles, but it had proven once more that one creature's will could bend the course of many, and in that truth lay its enduring power, its reason for surviving, its place. Not just as a beast of flesh but as a symbol, and as night fell and stars burned bright above, the buffalo lay beside the kitten under the open sky, its breath slow, steady, carrying the promise that tomorrow it would rise again, and stand again, no matter how great the storm, for such was its destiny, carved not by chance but by choice, and choice, it knew, was the truest strength of all. The buffalo moved through the endless prairie with the weight of seasons upon its shoulders, each muscle in its massive frame attuned to the rhythm of the earth, the distant rumble of thunder echoing the pounding of its own heart, and as it crossed the wide valleys and steep ridges, the air carried scents of rain-soaked grass, the tang of wildflowers, the musk of hidden predators, and the faint, almost imperceptible traces of human encroachment, the occasional charred stump, the distant hum of machinery, the flash of metal against sunlight. Yet the buffalo pressed onward, not fleeing from the change but asserting its presence upon it, for it had learned that endurance was more than surviving the moment, it was shaping the moments that came after, and the plains themselves seemed to bend in recognition, grasses bowing under its steps, birds lifting in flight, the wind carrying its deep bellows across canyons and hills, and everywhere, silently, the buffalo left marks, impressions of hooves in soil, dust rising in spirals, the faint scent of sweat and fur mingling with the earth, all of it a testament to existence, to vigilance, to the story of a creature that had become more than any predator could claim, more than any human could harness, a legend in motion, a force of life that demanded recognition, and yet as it moved, the buffalo was acutely aware of the presence of others, not just the tiny kitten that had stayed at its side, now a creature of sleek fur and quick reflexes, but also distant echoes of those it had protected, traces of lion and cubs, the wind carrying the faint calls of survivors it had intervened to save, each one a thread in a growing tapestry, a network of lives linked to its own through the power of action and compassion. And as it climbed a ridge that overlooked a valley filled with whispering grasses, the storm clouds above gathering into dark swells, it sensed something new, a shift in the very energy of the land, the kind of shift that came when events far beyond sight were unfolding, and instinct compelled it forward, hooves striking stone and soil with a cadence that seemed to resonate with the heartbeat of the world itself, and in the valley below, shadows moved, not just of predators or prey but of humans, their voices carried faintly on the wind, their tools glinting in ways that spoke of intent, construction, encroachment, change, and the buffalo understood in a way no human could fully grasp that its role was no longer simply survival but intervention, guardianship, the assertion of life against forces that sought only to bend and reshape, and so it descended into the valley, muscles coiled with power, yet every step measured, deliberate, for it had learned that strength alone was not enough, that intelligence, empathy, and strategy were as essential to enduring as the raw force of body, and as it moved, it began to notice the smaller signs, subtle shifts in the behavior of animals around it, birds calling warnings, foxes pausing mid-stride, the low growl of unseen predators in hidden hollows, and each signal was a piece of a puzzle, a guide through the landscape fraught with hazards both natural and human-made, and the buffalo's mind, sharp and calculating despite its ancient instincts, began to map out paths, anticipate threats, assess risks, and weigh outcomes, for the world had grown complex, and survival now demanded wisdom as much as strength. Alongside this, the buffalo felt the pull of memory, memories not just of physical scars but of moral ones, of choices made in moments of crisis, the lifting of a struggling lion cub from the jaws of death, the shielding of helpless creatures from packs of hyenas, the countless nights under storm-laden skies when it had waited, immobile, while danger passed, and those memories created a quiet authority, an internal compass that guided each action with a balance of courage and restraint, and as the valley opened into a broader plain, dotted with watering holes and patches of new growth, the buffalo realized it was not alone, for a herd had begun to emerge from hidden ridges and gullies, drawn perhaps by instinct, by curiosity, or by the legend that now preceded this singular creature, and in that moment the buffalo assumed a new role, not simply as an individual surviving but as a leader, a protector, a force capable of influencing more than just its own fate, for the herd watched its every move, learning, responding, following its lead, and in that silent communication there was a profound understanding, the kind that could not be taught by humans, only observed, only lived. As the sun rose higher, burning through lingering clouds and casting shimmering heat waves across the plain, the buffalo guided the herd toward a hidden water source, its massive horns cutting through low branches, its heavy body brushing aside obstacles, and with every step, the terrain became a lesson, a test of both endurance and patience, and when a predator, a lone lion, scarred and wary, appeared at the edge of the herd, the buffalo did not panic, did not charge blindly, but positioned itself strategically, a living barrier, the herd instinctively pressing behind it, and the lion hesitated, recognizing in the deep eyes of the buffalo something elemental, something more than brute force, and slowly backed away, disappearing into the tall grasses, and in that moment, the buffalo understood that its actions had consequences far beyond itself, that courage exercised with intelligence could reshape outcomes, protect the weak, assert balance, and that this was its calling, a calling that would define not just the rest of its life but the lives of countless others across the vast expanse of the plains, and as the day wore on, it led the herd through sun-scorched fields, across small streams, under the watchful gaze of raptors, over hills that echoed with the sound of distant thunder, and every encounter, every choice, reinforced the legend of this singular buffalo, whose name would echo through generations of creatures and humans alike, a symbol of endurance, of compassion, of wisdom born from experience. And as night fell once more, the herd settled around a cluster of trees, the buffalo standing sentinel in the center, its massive body silhouetted against a sky painted with stars, the kitten curled at its feet, eyes wide, listening, and in the stillness, the buffalo felt the pulse of the land beneath it, the heartbeat of life itself, and knew that this was more than survival, more than leadership, it was legacy, the understanding that one being could embody the wild, protect it, guide it, inspire it, and that through patience, intelligence, and the unyielding will to act rightly, the balance of the plains could be preserved. For so long as the buffalo remained, the plains themselves would remember the lessons of courage, the bonds of unlikely friendship, the power of endurance and the infinite value of compassion. And as the moon rose high, casting silver light over the herd, over the kitten, over the silent trees, the buffalo breathed deeply, muscles relaxing yet ready, ears twitching at the faintest sound of movement, eyes scanning the horizon, knowing that tomorrow would bring new tests, new storms, new predators, new humans with their endless tools and plans, yet within that knowledge lay confidence. For the buffalo had become more than a solitary creature of flesh, it had become the embodiment of the wild, a living force of protection, resilience, and moral authority, and in this truth lay peace, and in this truth lay power. And so through the long night, beneath the endless stars, the buffalo and the kitten rested, bodies entwined with the rhythm of the earth, breathing as one with the wilderness, carrying forward the unbroken legacy of the plains, a story of survival, of guardianship, of courage and wisdom, a story that would endure in memory and spirit long after the hoofprints faded into dust, long after storms had washed the soil, long after time itself had moved onward, for in the buffalo's presence, the land remembered what it meant to endure, to act with heart, to protect and inspire, and the world would never be quite the same. The first rays of dawn stretched across the horizon like molten gold, illuminating the prairie in a glow that made every blade of grass shimmer as though the earth itself had awakened in reverence to the buffalo, whose massive frame now moved with a measured grace, each step a testament to the trials it had survived and the countless lives it had touched. And as the wind swept across the open plains, carrying the scent of wet soil, wild sage, and distant smoke from human encampments, the buffalo lifted its head and inhaled deeply, nostrils flaring as it caught the faintest trace of danger, the kind that only a creature born of the wild could sense, and though the kitten, now agile and confident, darted around its massive hooves, batting at grass stems and watching the horizon with wide, curious eyes, the buffalo remained vigilant, its dark, intelligent gaze sweeping the valley and ridges that stretched for miles, for it knew that the delicate balance of the land and its inhabitants was always under threat, and every creature, predator or prey, human or animal, played a part in the unfolding story, a story in which the buffalo had become both guardian and legend, a living embodiment of resilience and compassion. And today, as the herd it had protected grew in number, following its lead with unspoken trust, the buffalo felt the stirring of something extraordinary, a series of events that would challenge not only its strength but its wisdom, for on the far ridge, beyond the reach of its usual territory, it detected movement that was unfamiliar, calculated, and potentially perilous. A group of humans, armed not with simple tools but with the kind of devices that could alter the land irrevocably, surveying, measuring, marking, and yet pausing as if they sensed the presence of the buffalo, and in that moment, the creature realized that its role had expanded, that the survival of the plains, the safety of its herd, and the preservation of life in this corner of the wilderness rested upon its vigilance and decisive action, and so it advanced toward the ridge with deliberate steps, each hoof-fall resonating across the soil, stirring dust and the scent of rain-soaked earth, and as it approached, the humans shifted uneasily, some drawing weapons, some snapping pictures, some speaking in hushed, anxious tones, unaware that their fate in this encounter was bound not by technology but by the sheer presence of a being whose power and intelligence defied categorization, and the buffalo stopped at the crest, head raised, horns curved like the crescent moon, chest heaving with deep, steady breaths, eyes locked on the intruders, and in that tense pause, time seemed to stretch, as if the plains themselves were holding their breath, watching, waiting for the next move, and then, without aggression but with undeniable authority, the buffalo let out a deep, resonant bellow that rolled across the valleys and hills, a sound that carried not threat but command, and the humans froze, their machines trembling slightly, their voices faltering, and in the silence that followed, the buffalo moved again, a slow, deliberate advance that communicated intelligence, strategy, and moral purpose, and as it walked, it noticed signs of wildlife disruption, trampled grass, frightened birds lifting into the sky, and the faint, unmistakable scent of predators drawn to human activity, and it understood that its mission was clear: to restore balance. To protect, to lead, to teach, and to assert the unspoken rule that life, in all its forms, held value beyond exploitation, and as it approached the humans more closely, one of them raised a device that emitted a sharp, high-pitched sound, intended to deter, to provoke fear, yet the buffalo did not waver, muscles coiled, horns angled for protection but not for attack, and the humans, sensing something primal in the gaze of the creature, began to retreat, some stumbling, some backing slowly, and the buffalo, recognizing the shift, halted, letting the herd follow, moving them through hidden passes and along streams that wound like silver threads through the grass, guiding them away from danger, teaching the young and inexperienced how to navigate, to sense threats, to follow instinct tempered by wisdom, and all the while, the kitten raced ahead and back, its small voice carrying, alerting, celebrating, a symbol of the bonds that could form across species and the subtle joys of companionship. And as the sun climbed higher, the herd reached a new water source, hidden and pure, the kind of sanctuary that only the buffalo could have found through intuition and experience, and they drank, the sounds of lapping water, splashing, and soft purring mingling, a symphony of life renewed, and in that moment of respite, the buffalo allowed itself to close its eyes briefly, sensing the satisfaction of survival, the accomplishment of guardianship, yet it did not rest for long, for the knowledge of impending challenges never left its mind, and as clouds gathered on the horizon, signaling another storm, it led the herd to shelter beneath ancient trees whose roots dug deep into the soil, intertwining with the lives of countless other creatures, and it remained there, vigilant, listening to the wind, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a predator, the faint clatter of human activity, knowing that tomorrow would require the same courage, the same wisdom, the same unyielding resolve. And as night descended, the moon casting silver across the prairie, the buffalo lay among its herd, kitten nestled between its massive forelegs, and it allowed a moment of quiet reflection, sensing not just the immediate challenges but the far-reaching impact of its actions, the way stories of its deeds might ripple through the consciousness of other humans, other animals, the way a single act of protection, a single assertion of life's value, could inspire reverence, care, change. And as stars burned bright in the infinite sky, the buffalo dreamed in the stillness, of lightning-split trees, of rivers it had guided the young across, of battles fought against predators, of lives saved, of lessons taught through action and presence, of a world that could be shaped by compassion as much as by strength, and in that dreaming, it recognized its own legacy, not merely as a creature of flesh and horn, but as an agent of equilibrium, a teacher of resilience, a guardian whose story would echo long after hoofprints had faded, and as the night deepened, a quiet understanding settled over the plains, that the buffalo, a being of immense power and unmatched empathy, had become more than legend. It was the living embodiment of what it meant to care, to act, to protect, to endure, and in that truth lay a promise to all life upon the prairie, a promise that as long as creatures like it walked the land, there would be hope, there would be courage, and there would always be a reminder that even in the wild, even amidst struggle, acts of intelligence, compassion, and sacrifice could shape the course of countless lives. And with that understanding, the buffalo rose once more to its feet, silent, massive, eternal, ready to face whatever horizon awaited. And as the kitten scampered alongside, it was clear that this story, ongoing and evolving, would continue to inspire, to teach, and to resonate, a testament to the enduring power of connection, guardianship, and the indomitable spirit of a single creature standing tall upon the endless prairie. And so as the moon traced its arc across the sky and the first whispers of wind carried promises of dawn,